Diane, I want to talk a little bit about human sexuality, and especially the question of its essential goodness. It raises, in my mind, problems of shame, of guilt, of Christian perspectives that have been developed over the years, and I'm pleased to talk with you about this topic. I consider you to be an extremely insightful person and have great way of looking at the human situation and of helping people work through a lot of difficulties and problems. And I think that very often the human difficulties in marriage counseling and dealing with young people and so on have to do with attitudes, fundamental attitudes towards sexuality. So I think it's important for us to begin to explore that. I just set the stage a little bit and say that there has been a Christian outlook, unfortunately, that has sort of looked down upon sex, that has seen it as debased in one way or another. It links in with sort of a tendency in our culture to think of sex in animalistic terms, as or as simply a performance kind of thing. So that we need to explore this from a number of different angles, I think. This question of the essential goodness of sex, or put more broadly, what is our general attitude towards it?
And that general attitude gets formed so early on in life. It's way before church even becomes involved, usually in a child's life. There's a wonderful story that John Bradshaw had talked about years ago, that when he was little, he was discovering what turned adults on, what really got him to just think he was terrific. And he discovered one time at the dinner table he could make an ear wiggle. And they called everybody to say, "You got to see this. Watch what Johnny can do." And he'd wiggle his ear, and they thought it was just terrific. And then a couple of days later, he found his elbow, and he could make his elbow do little tricks. And they thought, well, my gosh, he got wonderful raves from every adult he showed all his little tricks to. Well, one time he's getting ready for bed, and he thought, boy, if the elbow got him, wait. So the next day, when they were having company on Sunday afternoon, he decides he's going to show him his new part. And so he walks into the living room, and he begins, and his mother grabs him and says, "I don't believe you did that. You put that away, right? You get out of this room right now." And he said, and I wonder how sexuality became associated with shame.
With shame, yes.
But his comment was, if the nose got him, wait till he sees this. Yeah. But shame does start so early on in terms of our parts, and that we don't even call them by their appropriate names as a rule.
Do you have a suggestion along this line in terms of families? And I take it you're saying that the early sexual attitudes are coming from watching your parents, and observing their interactions and how they deal with you.
Right.
I mean, I just one thing that I would come to my mind is the great importance of husband and wife, of being affectionate to one another in front of their children, of allowing their children to see that they care for one another, and that their relationship is a bodily one, and that there's a fundamental goodness about that. In other words, I think you start to pick up as a youngster from your parents, not just what they say about do this or that, but how they interact with one another.
That's assuming that they associate their own little sex organs with
it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
I don't know
I'm not talking about that. That's broader. I'm talking about sexuality in terms of affectivity, of intimacy, of gender differences. No, it's not a matter of connecting it in with genital activity or knowing what the act of intercourse is. It's seeing how males and females can interact. I think the fundamental problem has to do with bodiliness. That is, what think we of our bodiliness? And, of course, in our Christian tradition, I think in its roots and in its best, we see bodiliness as fundamentally good. God looks down on the creation, and when he makes things, he sees these are good. And he makes men and women, he says, this is very good what I have made. And our Catholic sense is that the created world, including our bodiliness, is graced, has a fundamental goodness about it.
But there's a whole advertising media that says your bodiliness is wonderful as long as you fit into appropriate standards.
Sure, of course, that becomes part of the distortion. The question is in our Christian tradition, is there some positive sense of bodiliness that we can draw on to help us to overcome this problem of shame, as you describe it. And I would think, while I would admit it's been extremely distorted throughout the tradition and by the secular culture in which we live, we have to find those positive roots. In the Christian terms, I think the great culprit, and often pointed to, is St. Augustine, and who has given us quite a pessimistic view of sexuality. Augustine really needs to be seen probably more carefully about how Augustine did actually work out his questions of sexuality. As we know, he did live with a woman that was in sort of a common law marriage with, and he spent, I think it was 14 years with her, but he was very faithful to her and so on. Later on, he did take a mistress for a brief period of time. But Augustine's general idea was that sexual pleasure was a negative in life, that it took us away from God, and that it was justified only if it was used to bring children into the world. And unfortunately, for this area of sexuality, Augustine has been the great influence throughout all of Christian history. There's reasons for that. He's one of the greatest theologians, one of the two greatest, with Thomas Aquinas. And someone has said all theology is nothing but a footnote to Augustine. And so he is the great shaping influence. Unfortunately, he had a very poor outlook on sexuality, and that has translated itself into our own attitude. So within Protestantism, we have Puritanism, which is sort of as a debased idea of sexuality. And in the Catholic tradition, we have Jansenism, which looked down upon the body. And so we need, if we're going to overcome the shame problem that you're talking about, we need to find a way to, out of our Christian tradition, to show that bodiliness has an essential goodness. And I'm going back to the creation to get hold of that. I don't know if you want to stay with that for a while or not, do you? Because I want to come back to your other point about the secular outlook that really, you said, well, yes, but there's other messages. That is, your body's good only if it fits into certain stereotypical kind of picture that we've been given by the culture. You want to talk more about that?
Well, I think when one talks about bodiliness is okay, that it's bodiliness that's okay that fits a stereotype, and it was kind of interesting. There was a study done a few years ago about the difference in body feelings with males and females when we talk about gender sexuality, and the difference is that 70% of males are pretty okay with how they look. They're not really too upset with this little pouch here or what's wrong there. By contrast, women, there were only 15%.
15?
Yes, that were happy.
Telling statistics.
Yes, it was sad.
Very sad. A constant experience of mine in working with collegians for over 20 years is to run into collegiate women who are very attractive, nice-looking young women who do not think they are attractive.
That's true.
And it's always extremely surprising to me. Well, it isn't after so many years, but it's really, and it's terrible. It hurts them, and it hurts their self-esteem. And part of it is they're simply off target. I mean, in many cases, objectively speaking, or if you get a group of members of the opposite sex and say, is this an attractive woman or not, would generally say yes. And this particular attractive woman thinks she isn't. In other words, she's not in touch with reality. Her emotions are inappropriate. This dislike of her own body is inappropriate. And of course, we all know why this is, don't we?
Yes,
this is
we
due to Playboy magazine and to the all of that says there's an ideal body type that every woman has got to somehow live up to. Thus, we have the diet industry, and we've got bulimic problems that women have trying to slim down to this particular image. And so it's a very destructive thing that we have in our culture.
But it's not without foundations. When males are asked what they prefer first, looks, personality, sense of humor, ability to earn money, men chose looks first.
Yes.
Women chose personality first.
Yes, you're right.
I mean, it's not without foundation.
I think we should see the cultural relativity of this. I mean, if you take the Rubens paintings of the late medieval period, or the Renaissance period, I guess I should say,
right.
Then we've got a different body type. that is lauded and seen to be attractive. Thus, whatever we have going in our own culture about, the attractiveness of the female form is culturally conditioned. We have to remember that. And there's a whole industry, a movie industry, a pornographic industry that has fostered this kind of thing.
Certainly.
So we have to begin to see through that. But part of the problem, therefore, becomes a male problem, doesn't it? To see in what ways that we are taken by that cultural stereotype, and in other ways to look to it. I would tell you a case. I dealt with a young man who was going with a very attractive woman, and they were a little older. They're already 27, 28, and so on. And he's very successful, well-to-do, and so on. And this woman is the perfect mate for him in many ways, and he knows that, likes her, and so on. And he actually said this, he can't marry her because she doesn't look like the centerfold in Playboy. She can't. He has to find that type, even though in every other way. And she was a very good-looking woman, I must say. And he recognized that in himself. He said, "This is so sad, and I'm hurting my life, and I'm probably passing up the best marriage partner, but I can't do it because he's so taken by this cultural stereotype." It's really a major problem.
It's a sad one, because it means that less than 1% of people then probably feel great about themselves if they're female, and overall, because most... Do you ever sit down at a mall or at Cedar Point and look at people walk by? Most people are not all that terrifically attractive. Most people are average people.
Yes.
Most people do not look like who you see in magazines.
Exactly.
And oftentimes, if I have someone that I'm working with who is anorexic or suicidal, and part of it is a feeling of, especially a young person who feels intrinsically ugly, I will often send them to a mall and have them look at people, spend 45 minutes just looking at people, and you count how many people you think are extremely attractive, male or female. There aren't that many.
Yes, that's right. And that's a good way to do it, to get people to...
You have to see it.
Yeah.
You have to literally see that that's a fact.
Right.
But we do a terrible disservice think that way.
Yes. Let's proceed here. Do we with trying to resurrect some of these positive values, and as we look at sexuality? I know one of the things that you like to talk a lot about is the whole idea of eros. Eros, used in a lot of the literature, has to do just with our passions for life and for growth. And part of the feeling is that sexuality, the reason we've looked down on sexuality is that it's got disassociated from eros. That when sex becomes merely genital and merely thought of in terms of performance and ideal body forms, that you lose eros. That is the passion and the drive, the excitement, the joy, the spontaneity that have to do with sexuality.
The whole body response that's possible. I wouldn't want to make that sound like it's an everyday probability, but eros is such a life-giving force. A lot of literature, even written about love addiction, is that one keeps looking for eros, and when eros starts to wane, one looks for another person, so that initial excitement can begin again. And that's kind of sad, because it's just a never-ending battle to keep something going, that unless you use the intensity for feeling life itself, for feeling the spirit of life, and making every encounter with that person, whether it's a communication encounter or a sexual encounter, an opportunity to put your whole self into it and find out what makes that other person tick, it does fade in time. And sexually addicted people, addicted on romance, women usually get addicted on romance, and men can more easily get addicted to the high, the chase, and lots of sad people.
Yes, much of divorce, unfortunately, flows precisely out of this misperception, I think, that one can recreate the romance and bring back the chemistry and then keep sort of an endless cycle up like that.
Well, I think one can recreate the chemistry, but you don't have to go find another person to recreate the chemistry. You can do it within your own relationship, but it takes an awful lot of ingenuity and a lot of caring to risk and to drop previously held perceptions.
Yes, and that energy is well worth expending. The energy looking for a new partner and all that goes on with that, and often destroying marriages and so on, seems to be very destructive use of energy. If you're going to try to work at this with your marriage partner and be faithful to your vows, there seems to be a lot more actual human payoff in that. In other words, it's back to our idea that Christianity helps the human to flourish. Our sense is we have a Christian humanism, and that to follow the ways of the gospel and the teachings of Jesus and is to find a way to be more fully human. It's to be guided in how we ought to relate to one another. And that's a hard sell. Because the secular world doesn't see it that way. It has another outlook on how you're going to be happy or fulfilled. And so it's a constant battle to raise up this idea that Christianity is a wisdom synthesis that has something to say about real life, in this case, human sexuality.
I would wonder if you would speak to one issue that I run into an awful lot, that Christians' views of the Christian view of sexuality is somehow going to be entrapping, is going to be non-life fulfilling but guilt-ridden. And there's an awful lot of the specter of guilt around sexuality, and it's seen as from a duty aspect. That kind of does a lot of damage to what might be a healthy relationship, a healthy marriage, if you will. When you think there's somebody telling me how to live appropriately and properly, and I'm not talking about infidelity here. I'm talking about saying yes when you mean no. I'm talking about being so worried about hurting somebody's feelings that I'm not leveling with them.
Yeah, in other words, you don't want to have intercourse as a married person, but you're not going to say that because...
Might hurt his feelings.
Yeah,
and the church would think I'm wonderful for that stance.
And that you would be doing wrong by refusing. You would not be doing your wifely duties, right?
Or vice versa.
Yeah, truly, but more often the other way, I think, statistically at least. But you're right, vice versa, male feeling that way also. Yeah, well, I mean, you pose it in terms of a question. There's a number of perspective points I offer. And first, I think, is to realize that what we have to say as Christians ought to be seen as a wisdom and not a particular set of laws. But we can't, it doesn't say in the Bible exactly what you're supposed to do in your bedroom. And really, we have to be careful about church pronouncements along that line being perceived as some sort of new legalism. But I think it's different to talk about our Christian tradition having a wisdom. That is an insight into the human condition and how we function best. And a guidance for you, a reminder that sex is not a plaything. A reminder that our bodiness is good. Reminder that intimacy is something that is properly sought. Reminder that pleasure is given to us as a gift by God. Reminder that we need to be honest and faithful in our relationships. So there's all kind of sort of general principles or wisdom that ought to be brought to bear on these questions, which you then need to interpret in proper ways. But the problem, I think, is this. It gets back to my bit about Augustine earlier. That is, the Christian tradition is not pure on this. No. It's very possible for teachers to pick out certain elements of it and to play them up and to give you guilt feelings. I think that is what has happened very often. In other words, it occurs out of that Augustinian sense that the only reason for having sex, the pleasures of sex, is to produce children. Now, we've moved beyond that. We've moved beyond Augustine with the Second Vatican Council that says there are two reasons for sexual activity. One is mutual love, fostering of intimacy and so on, and the other is producing children, and that they're both important parts of what sex is all about. And that's one of the first things we need to do, is to move beyond this whole thing. We need to bring in the social sciences and the psychological sciences. I don't think it's very helpful for young people who are engaging in masturbation to feel that, to look at this only in terms of mortal sin. They will be helped by looking at it in terms of their own psychological development. Mm-hmm. They need to have a framework for looking at individual acts of masturbation, so that it is not just a question of mortal sin, and therefore not being able to go to Mass or to go to communion at Mass. What we want is for those young people to feel the presence of God as they struggle to achieve sexual integration. We want them to feel that the Lord is with them and that they're going through a human process that all human beings have to go through.
Are they feeling that the Lord is with them in terms of making them feel guilty, though?
Well, very often they are, and I think that's unfortunate. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's the way to view the problem. Mm-hmm. No, the production of guilt. I'm not opposed to guilt. When we are culpably in blameworthy fashion go against our conscience, we need to be held accountable, and there's a proper sense of guilt. The question is, how do you assess the whole business of that you're raising? If a woman in marriage judges that she's not ready for intercourse because there hasn't been a communication that day, or there's been anger and she's not ready to do that, and she honestly says, I'm not ready for this, or we need to talk or need to heal or something, then that should not be seen as sinful. She's not guilty. What she's doing is following out the wisdom of the gospel, it seems to me. So, yeah, go ahead.
Does it come from a lot of the old writings of kings where when one person married another, that was more or less seen as property? Even though we know with our heads that's not true, is there some sort of a subtle attitude that a man's wife and his children are his property, so to speak? And so, that sounds like a bigoted thing to say. I don't like to think of it that way, but there is an attitude of, well, I'm supposed to because he earns the living, or he puts a roof over my head, like it's a form of barter, which is a very dangerous thing. It's not a form of barter, it's a self-expression, and if that's not what it is, then it shouldn't, I hate the word should, but it isn't helpful to a relationship
to express one that way. I don't mind the word should.
I hate the word should.
I think it's a very good and healthy word, and this woman should not feel like that. This is an inappropriate way of thinking about marriage. She and her husband should find a healthier way to look at what marriage is all about.
They could choose to. How about that?
Well, whatever way, it's a destructive sort of outlook. And
certainly
what you're pointing to is marriage as a partnership, as a loving relationship, a chance for mutual giving and receiving, and an opportunity not to produce a clone, but to help another person grow and develop and to become more mature. You're looking, you're talking a healthy relationship, and that's the kind of direction people really ought to try to move in. And in any way the Christian tradition undercuts that, we have to be critical of it. That's the problem. The Christian tradition has not been consistent on this, and it's only been developing, and we need to present to people what the Second Vatican Council has said. In a Catholic world, we need to overcome the Augustinian pessimism about sexual pleasure and be able to see pleasure as a gift of God, and used properly with the virtue of prudence, that it is a valuable thing within married life, and it's a valuable thing as human beings try to achieve sexual integration.
But would you agree that the Church does come out rather vague in terms of sexuality? It feels vague to me.
Yeah. Yes, I would say that. There's conflicting signals. There's a mixed tradition.
There's a lot of ambivalence.
Yeah, I agree with that. And again, the word church has to be distinguished. We have various parts of the church. We have church leadership centered in the Vatican. We have bishops. We have theologians. Some of the stuff written by Catholic theologians in the United States on sexuality, I think, is wonderful. I point to the work of Lisa Cahill as a very good example, a fine woman moral theologian who writes wonderful things about sexuality, it seems to me. We got Evelyn and James Whitehead. They have a wonderful book called A Sense of Sexuality that brings together a lot of the research of psychology, sociology, and so on. So within the Catholic theological world, we have a lot of good things. And among Catholic lay people, ordinary people who are living out married life, we have some wonderful perceptions, it seems to me, of what marriage is and how it ought to be worked at and what role sex plays. Very realistic picture. not one that idealizes sex or makes it sound like married couples spend all day in bed, the way our collegians sometimes think about it and so on, but is realistic because people are living it. So when you say church, I want to distinguish out. I'm not always happy with some of the official messages that come out on sexuality. I think there's a much greater wisdom among our Catholic lay people, and I think very often the theologians are getting around to articulating that in helpful ways.
I guess I'm talking more grassroots from a pulpit in a classroom.
Sermons, preach.
Yeah, I am.
Teaching,
what is? It feels like there's a lot of hedging, and maybe that's good. I'm not saying it's bad or it's good. I'm just saying that it is.
Well, I don't want hedging. I want wisdom. I think that's what we have to do. We have to.
But one can't assume that there is an answer. There isn't always an answer to every question
Wisdom
that's
doesn't
asked.
claim there's an answer to everything. Wisdom offers principles, guidance, outlooks, perspectives, attitudes. That's the difference that I'm making before between wisdom and a legalism that says you're going to legislate every act in the bedroom, which obviously one cannot do. That's why I'm back to saying that there's a wisdom synthesis that we need to bring to bear. It says sexuality is fundamentally good. It's a gift from God, that the chemistry can be used productively, that it brings people together, and that marriage is a partnership. All of these positive messages, I think.
Does
Diane,
the
you have
church
only a
get,
few seconds.
Okay, does the church get specific with people in terms of, let's say someone is attracted to someone else who is not their partner? Does the church, does the wisdom that you're referring to address specifics like that?
Well, it addresses the specifics in terms of you have to take the principles and run with them.
Okay.
I mean, if somebody's
That's what I was
married and
thinking.
they're attracted to someone who isn't their partner, then there's the virtue of prudence in our tradition that says you better be careful.
But also understanding that that's a natural thing. It's
Yeah.
not an evil thing. It's a natural
Right.
thing.
Yeah, and I think that's the wisdom that we would want to see. Well, Diane, there's so much more, and I know you have much more to say, and I appreciate your contributions, talking about human sexuality, Christian perspectives, and in this case, the fundamental goodness of sexuality as a gift from God, one that we are to use responsibly.